So good afternoon, everyone. It's actually good morning from me. Here I am just outside of Rome giving you these lectures. So I'm very fresh in the morning, and now I guess it's towards coming towards the end of the day for you. So thank you very much for joining me again today. So what I thought I would do today is, first of all, I would spend a little bit of time just summarizing our first lecture and then giving you an opportunity to ask any questions arising out of the lecture. So please think now and during the next few minutes if there's any comments you have on what we talked about in yesterday in the lecture that we had 2 days ago, or if there are any questions that you have that I can answer. So I will look at the comments and I will respond to them after this brief summary. And then after that, we will look further into the evolution of the international financial institution landscape following Bretton Woods. And then finally, we will look at multilateral financial institutions as intergovernmental organizations. And I've not forgotten either that there's a question from the last class from Professor Sato about governing law. So I can address that during the course of this lecture as well, if we have time. Otherwise, I will push this into the next lecture that we have. So that's the program for today. So if we look at the first lecture that we had, much of it was really an historical survey that was leading up to and including the year 1944. And 1944 is really a threshold date for international financial institutions because it was the year in which the Bretton Woods institutions were established, namely the International Monetary Fund and the IBRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And we noted also at the time that there had been an attempt to create an international trade body, but that failed. So in our lecture, we saw that there are a number of circumstances that existed prior to 1944. The first was that the notion of development was not invented in 1944. It had long existed. Trade, for example, between nations is at least as old as recorded history in the West, looking back at records from Mesopotamia, or from the East, if you look back at the records coming out of China. So over the centuries, there have been various attempts at promoting the development of other states, including by the League of Nations. So the second circumstance we saw is that in the early 19th century, we saw the beginnings of some states pooling their sovereignty in ways that benefited them collectively. So we saw the example of the German states, the independent German states in the 19th century, establishing a customs union, the Zollverein, and that was designed to support the development of all the cooperating states. And this initiative, it entailed those states suspending their rights to impose trade restrictions, such as tariffs. So international organizations also existed in 1944, and some of them were advancing objectives that we would today understand as fostering development. Now, the oldest is still in operation, namely the Central Commission for the Navigation of the Rhine. And as we noted, its purpose is to secure international navigation along one of Europe's most important economic rivers, and with an objective of promoting European prosperity. So that kind of language is something that we could understand today as associated with development. A third circumstance that we saw that existed in 1944 is that there was already a tradition of ideas affecting development moving across borders. So this explained, for example, why the Civil Code of Japan, and also in Taiwan as a result of the developments in Japan, being based on the Germanic model. And the idea, the notion of ideas floating across borders also explains why the Civil Code of Turkey is based on that of Switzerland. We noted also that in the United States, constitutional decisions of the Supreme Court frequently cite the philosophy set out in On Liberty, the text written by John Stuart Mill in England, drawing on the thoughts of Wilhelm von Humboldt in Prussia. So here we had ideas being developed in Prussia, being picked up in England and being further refined, and then being claimed in the United States. So ideas generally, and the idea of law in particular, are very migratory. So by 1944, there was already a long tradition of states borrowing and building on foreign ideas to further their own development and also the development of others. So in 1944, it was an important year, but it is not like nothing existed before 1944 and then suddenly everything existed. It's much more a matter of evolution. Nonetheless, Bretton Woods, it was a huge moment in the history of countries cooperating together in common economic and financial cause. So this is particularly so in relation to the IMF, because in order to become members of the IMF, states had to suspend their sovereign right to set exchange rates. Suspending the right to exercise any aspect of sovereignty is always politically difficult. However, this was achieved partly by conditioning membership of the IBRD on membership of the IMF. So we saw that countries that wished to borrow from the World Bank, they would have to surrender their ability to set exchange rates. So to become a member then of the World Bank, you first had to become a member of the IMF. Becoming a member of the IMF involved the surrender of sovereignty. Then we also noted that the Bretton Woods decisions had anticipated and really bolstered the United Nations system. And the United Nations is perhaps the ultimate example of states cooperating together. So interestingly, the Bretton Woods Conference itself was styled as a United Nations conference, even though the United Nations had not yet come into being. And both the IMF and the World Bank immediately became specialized agencies of the United Nations once that institution had become established. So Bretton Woods was not only important for the story of economic and financial cooperation, but it's also part of the larger story of all states cooperating together for the betterment of all. Now, in our lectures, we also noted that going forward, we will focus on the classic multilateral financial institution or international financial institution, namely one where the international organization supports development by providing members with financing facilities in aid of specific projects and programs. So that's very much what the IBRD does. And this is different from the IMF, which does make loans, but this is really for balance of payments support rather than financing specific projects and programs. So in the remainder of our lectures, we will look at the classic IFI, or International Financial Institution. And here it's best to think in terms of the IBRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the first part of the World Bank Group as being really the exemplar of international financial institutions. It was the first of them all, and it's really the progenitor of the regional development banks as well, and to a lesser extent, the sub-regional development banks that have followed. So that's my summary of the last lecture, and I would like to encourage you all to share some comments. So let's pause for a few minutes, and I give you an opportunity to share on chat any views that you have. You can share anything. There are no right or wrong answers. If you want to share some observations or comments, if you have some questions, then you could pose those as well. So you may want to share what you learned and anything interesting that you learned, anything that surprised you, anything that perplexed you, any questions that you have, please go ahead and share, and we will just pause now for a few minutes to enable you to do that. So thank you for those who have posted some comments. I imagine others are still writing, so if so, please continue, and it's useful to get the feedback from you all, and hopefully that can inform your own thinking and your own understanding if you can read comments that have been provided by others. So several comments here. I think one relates to conditionality. So the IMF is particularly well known for the conditionality it imposes. And I think the reason for that is because of two things. The first is that its counterparties are states. So when you're dealing with states, then it is possible to impose obligations on the states. Whereas if you are dealing with a non-state actor, such as a private sector borrower or a municipal government, then it's not possible to impose obligations on the state. And the IMF, its counterparties are always states. This is also true with the World Bank. Its counterparties are always states. But with the regional development banks and with the AIB, the counterparties may be states or they may not be. And where they are not, then clearly there is no opportunity to impose conditionality, even if that was thought appropriate. And the second reason is that when the IMF is dealing with states, it is not financing specific projects or specific programs. It is really assisting the country in enabling it to meet its general financial obligations, addressing its balance of payments difficulties. And that is something that departs from the activities of the classic international financial institutions which are concerned with financing specific projects and programs. So this is why conditionality arises most often at the IMF and much less so elsewhere. Now, if a regional development bank is dealing with a sovereign and it is financing a specific project or program, it may also be the case that some kind of conditionality is imposed, but it will be a specific kind of conditionality that is tailored to the project or program that is being financed. So the example that I gave yesterday was if a regional development bank finances a railway line through one or more countries, then one of the conditions that it may impose on the government, which is borrowing, is that the government does have to adopt a law regulating the use of the railways. So this is a form of conditionality. But like all forms of conditionality, it is largely designed, well, it's partly designed to advance the interests of development. So here it's important to have an engagement with the party being financed, but it's also there to protect the capital of the institution providing the financing, because there's no sense in lending a lot of money to advance some enterprise if the fundamentals are not in place to ensure that that enterprise can be economically sustainable. So that's, I hope, answers the question with regard to conditionality. There was another question about voting, and I don't see it now, but I remember it was about voting, and it was really about how do we identify what the appropriate votes are of members of organizations. So the rules vary from one international organization to another, but the one thing that they all have in common is that the approach is different from what one sees in international organizations generally. So in international organizations generally, the principle is that one member gets one vote. So that is what is the basic premise at the United Nations, for example, that every country, whether it has the largest economy in the world, such as the United States, or a very small economy, like some of the Pacific or Caribbean island states, they each have one vote. Of course, it's more complex in the UN because of how the Security Council operates. But the general principle, and certainly the way in which the General Assembly operates, is that every member has one vote, irrespective of the size of its economy. Now, with international financial institutions, that is not the case. So the general proposition is that the level of voting is reflective of the size of the economy. There are some relatively minor, not sometimes slightly less than minor modifications to this principle, and we will discuss this in a bit more detail later on. One of the dilemmas in development is, and particularly in relation to international financial institutions, is to find a way in which smaller countries or countries with smaller economies can have their voice heard. So obviously their voice would be heard if everyone had the same vote, which is the case with international organizations generally. However, in international financial institutions, what those organizations are doing is making available the financial facilities that are made possible through capital contributions of members. And the capital contributions are generally reflective on the size of the economy of the contributors. So very large economies are expected to make the largest contribution to the capital. They also have the largest amount of callable capital at risk. They therefore demand a proportionate voice in the decisions that are being made. The difficulty, if one takes that to extremes, is that the countries with very small economies will have no say at all. And one way in which this dilemma is addressed is by setting aside a certain percentage of the shares of an organization and distributing those evenly across all of the members. So in the AIIB, which we will discuss a little bit later, we have the notion of basic shares, and the basic shares amount to 12% of the total shareholding, and these are spread equally across all of the members, so that the largest member of the AIIB, namely China, receives the same number of shares as the smallest member of the AIIB, which I think is the Cook Islands. So That's the idea of the basic shares, and then the rest of the shares are all reflective of the size of the economy, more or less. There is a distinction made between regional members and non-regional members, but we will look at that a little bit later on in some depth. There was also a question or some observations about how the Bretton Woods Conference is operating, had operated, and its legacy. And I think there was also a comment saying it's great to learn about the World Bank and won't it be great to learn about other organizations as well. And that is true, and we will do that presently. Before we leave the World Bank, I would like to make a few comments about it because it did influence, and I guess it continues to influence how some of the other international organizations have organized themselves. So thank you very much for all of those comments. As we go along, if you have other comments or questions, please put them into the chat box. So today, the World Bank, it's concerned entirely with development. And at the time that it was established, a lot of the focus was also on reconstructing the economies of countries that had been shattered or interrupted during the Second World War. It surprises some people to learn that the first borrower of the World Bank was in fact France. So France today is a highly developed economy, but at the time, certainly in 1944, when Bretton Woods was established, and a few years later, by the time France drew down the first proceeds of the loan, its economy was in a very poor shape and it needed a lot of financial support. So it became the first borrower of the World Bank. But those elements of the objectives of the World Bank that relate to the reconstruction, effectively, of Europe because of the war, those can all be viewed as really having been spent. This is of historical interest only to us today. And all of the effort of the World Bank is expended in promoting development. Now, this purpose, this idea of fostering development, it's a thread that runs through all of the international financial institutions. So all of the international financial institutions are about fostering and promoting and financing development. There may be differences in terminology, there may be differences in focus, there may be differences in instruments, but they do all have that in common, even if there isn't a single definition that is shared by all the institutions about what development means, at least as reflected in their charters. But I would say that there is a common understanding among them about what this means, what development means. And you can see that in the fact that all of the international financial institutions have publicly associated themselves with the United Nations program to promote development through to the year 2030, which, as you know, goes by the catchier title of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals are all about promoting and achieving development. And the international financial institutions, even though they may not have a very nuanced legal definition of development reflected in their charters, they all identify with the UN view of what development means. This is unsurprising in the case of, say, the World Bank or the International Fund for Agricultural Development or the International Finance Corporation, because they are all specialized agencies of the United Nations. And it's also not surprising in the case of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, because it has observer status at the United Nations General Assembly and also at the meetings of the Economic and Social Council. But irrespective of whether international financial institutions are specialized agencies or have observer status of the UN, they all endorse the Sustainable Development Goals, and their strategies are very much tailored towards contributing to their achievement. So now what I would like to do is to go to identify the major international financial institutions and say a few words about each and try and draw out some themes about what connects them and what differentiates them. So we started with the World Bank. Let me finish with that now and make a number of observations. So the first is, as I mentioned before, that one objective was to support the countries that were affected in a very profound way by the Second World War. So this was a transient objective, and now it's of historical interest. The other objectives are legally expressed in broad terms, but the term development is not defined. If you think of the World Bank, for a long time, if you were to be asked, well, what is the purpose? Even those of the World Bank itself would say the purpose is to alleviate poverty. And more recently, if you look at the formal communications from the World Bank, it's about ending extreme poverty and boosting shared prosperity. So these are stated as being the twin aims. So it's not enough to just eliminate extreme poverty, but it's also important that prosperity is better shared. But if you look at the articles, if you look at the charter of the IBRD, there is no reference to poverty at all. So poverty is something that has been understood by the World Bank as being what the institution was really all about. And this was an understanding, I think, that really came about in the 1990s. Now, the articles or the charter of the IBRD, they also envisaged that most financing would be in the form of guarantees, that the private sector would provide financial support to the members of the World Bank, and that the World Bank would provide a guarantee. But for various reasons, that didn't happen. And in the end, the IBRD financed sovereign loans and provided sovereign guarantees itself directly. The sovereign loans being loans to the members, and the sovereign guarantees being the receipt of a guarantee from a member in support of a loan by the World Bank to an agency of the state. So this is what we mean by sovereign loans and sovereign guarantees. But the Charter of the World Bank, it really did not anticipate that this would be the mainstay of the World Bank's activity, but in fact, indeed it is so. So today, almost all financing from the World Bank is in the form of sovereign, of lending to sovereigns or lending to the government generally with guarantees from the sovereign. The articles of the World Bank, they also envisaged the financing of specific projects, particularly infrastructure projects, as really being the norm. But what we've seen over the years is that these have, on the whole, over the time span since the World Bank was created, this is really something that is a minority activity. So most of what the World Bank does is in the form of financing and supporting sectoral programs, and the better known ones and the ones where the amounts involved are very substantial are often in the area of health or in the area of education, for example. So this is something that's permitted by the IBRD Charter, but it was not envisaged as being the mainstay of its activity. The next point I wanted to make about the World Bank is that even though its financing remains critically important for its recipient countries, over the years, the World Bank has acquired a vast expertise. It's become a huge repository of development knowledge. So it is a center of expertise that the borrowing countries and others, including other international financial institutions, benefit from. And the World Bank is a very important provider of technical assistance. And finally, in relation to the World Bank, I would say that it is a key player in the development and promotion of international standards, including what we sometimes refer to as soft law. So a good example of the kind of standards that it promotes are those reflected in its well-known reports known as doing business. Now, the doing business reports, they identify different sectors of the economy and they assess how well each country is doing in implementing the relevant standards. So it's quite controversial because the methodology is complex, and complex methodology is always open to criticism, but it's also controversial because countries don't like to be rated worse than their peer countries, especially if they think that they themselves are doing better than their peers. But nonetheless, it's a very valuable report, well-read report. And so it's an example of how the World Bank draws on all the knowledge that it has and how it promotes and disseminates certain standards. And the World Bank actually also promotes soft law, and it's, for example, has promoted standards on investment. And investment is both cross-border and domestic. And a key element in those standards is that, according to the World Bank, the rules for domestic investment and cross-border investment ought, as a rule, to be the same. So it's an example of soft law. A sort of harder version of soft law, if you will, is that the World Bank has also promoted the establishment of another institution, namely the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, also known as ICSID, and ICSID is today actually a part of the World Bank Group. So that's all I wanted to say for now about the World Bank, but it's very important to talk about it because it is really the first of the international financial classic international financial institutions. So it really led the way. Secondly, it remains the largest. And thirdly, it has the longest experience. And fourthly, and very importantly for our purposes, this has greatly influenced what followed. So the first institution that followed, the IBRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development in 1944, was the International Financial Corporation in 1956, the IFC. So this was established just a decade later. And it was established because it was increasingly recognized that private sector resources needed to be mobilized in support of development. So the way that I suppose the world really thought in the mid-1940s is that development was all about engaging states and having the states, the state borrowers really driving and building and being players in the economy. And the role of the private sector at that time was not highlighted so much. And by 1956, there was a recognition that more needed to be done to encourage investment by the private sector, and there were instances where the private sector would need financing. So the IFC was established, and the IFC was not only able to make loans to non-members, it could also issue non-members with guarantees, and it could even invest in the equity of private sector parties, including funds. So the IFC can and does extensively invest in funds as well as other forms of equity. So that was an important moment in development, a recognition that the private sector needs to play a much greater role in development, and that they can play that role, but there is a need for some support from the international community. So you might ask yourself the question, well, why would a private sector organization seek financing from the International Finance Corporation? Why not seek funds from domestic sources? So there are a number of reasons for that, and the basic notion is that the IFC, like the other multilateral development banks, the other international financial institutions that have followed, they will provide support to the finance sector, but generally only where the institution can bring some difference. It can make some difference. So an obvious example is where there are just no other sources of financing available. So you can see in a very undeveloped country where there are already no domestic sources of financing, if there is a large project to be financed by the private sector, then there may not be any commercial bank ready to finance the project. And it might be because the country hosting the project is not well known, or it might be that it is well known, but for the wrong reasons. It's not known as a country that is supportive of investment. And so there may not be any financial support available anywhere else. And in those circumstances, institutions like the IFC will provide funding because no other organization is able to do that. So that's one form of what is referred to sometimes as additionality. So how is the IFC being additional? It is being additional by providing funds in circumstances where others are unable to provide those funds. Other examples of additionality are where there is financing available, but the financing that's available locally is very short term. So in developing countries, it's very difficult to obtain long-term financing. But for, say, an infrastructure project where the returns are expected to be generated over many years, and that is needed in order to recover the costs of the investment and to compensate for the risk, then the associated loan will be for many years and many years longer than what would be available on the domestic market. So in those circumstances, organizations like the IFC would be additional and would be able to provide this kind of funding. Now, a third reason is that there may be something other than finance that the institution is able to bring. So if a project is being established in a country that does not have very high environmental and social standards, for example, then a commercial lender would likely not insist on standards being followed beyond those that are imposed by the local law. But the international financial institution, as part of its lending, as part of its conditionality, if you like, may require that higher standards of environmental and social safeguards be respected. And so this may be what it is that the institution brings to the project. This is the additionality that, say, the IFC that we're now talking about would bring. And then finally, what the institution can bring in a country that is not well known or that is politically very volatile, it can bring its status and its privileges and its immunities to bear, which will benefit those associated with the project, or at least some of those associated with the project. And we'll talk a little bit more about this a little bit later, but sometimes a lender or sometimes a sponsor of a project will want to include an international financial institution because that helps alleviate the political risk. So if you're a sponsor of a project, you want to build something in a country that does not have an established record of respecting foreign investment, then if you have the International Financial Corporation or one of the other multilateral development banks investing in the project in a very visible way, then that may reduce the risk of an expropriation of the asset by the country, or at least to reduce the risk of the asset being expropriated without any compensation being payable. Because the IFC will be around for much longer than any of the projects that it's financing, and it will have a lot of political clout, and because it's a lender of last resort, like the other international financial institutions, it has a lot of sway over the governments that are its members and which borrow from it, or which allow private sector borrowings to be drawn from those institutions in relation to projects on the territory of those members. So that's one way in which the political risk can be reduced. Another way is that there are financing techniques that enable the preferred creditor status of the international financial institution, financial corporation to be shared. So the international financial institutions, they enjoy a certain status, certain privileges and immunities. They also enjoy what is known as preferred creditor status. So again, we will discuss all of these later on in more detail, but for now, be aware that there are means for the IFC and other institutions which finance the private sector to support the private sector in ways that the commercial banks cannot do. So that was the IFC. So the IFC is in 1956. And then in the subsequent decades, a number of regional development banks were created. And the major ones are the ones that I'm going to talk about. The first one was the Inter-American Development Bank, which was established in 1959. That's headquartered in Washington. The next is the African Development Bank, which was established in 1964, headquartered in Abidjan. The Asian Development Bank was established in 1966. That's headquartered in Manila. And the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, that was established in 1991, and that's headquartered in London. So these are the major regional development banks. The AIIB is also often referred to as a regional development bank, but it is really both a regional and a global organization for reasons that I'll explain when we come to talk about that. So if you look at the first three of the major regional development banks, the Inter-American Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the impulse behind their creation was that development would be further served by the creation of institutions that were more intimately familiar with the needs of their recipient members, something which the argument went would be made possible by a more limited regional focus. And that argument is really brought to the fore in those instances where the headquarters of the institution is located on the territory of a country which is expected to be a borrower. So that's certainly true with the African Development Bank and the Asian Development Bank. So other motives have sometimes been ascribed to the establishment of the regional international financial institutions. So one is that regional members, they want to have more influence over decisions relating to development that affect their region. So if you think of the large economies in Africa or the large economies in South America, they have relatively limited influence in the global organizations like the World Bank or like the IFC, but they can have much greater influence in a regional bank where they are one of the major players. So that's sometimes been one of the reasons why those regional powers have been keen to have their own regional bank. Another reason that I've read about is that some of the thinking behind the development of some of the regional development banks was that this was a way in which to aid the Western efforts in the Cold War, which ran from almost immediately after the Second World War until the fall of the Berlin Wall. So that also could be a reason. But I think for myself, what helps explain the sort of proliferation of regional development banks is partly this desire to be closer for decision making, to be closer to the projects, and for there to be this greater regional focus. So I think that's an important part of the explanation, and I think another important part is that the development needs of the world are enormous, and having more international financial institutions is a way of better meeting those needs. So it's not a crowded field. There's way many more development projects to be financed than there is capacity at all the international financial institutions. So there is no real competition among international financial institutions. There's a lot of cooperation, a lot of collaboration. So at all of these regional development banks, there is co-financing of projects. Quite often for a very large project that is being sponsored by a regional development bank in its region, there will be co-financing from a global international financial institution. So if you look at the AIIB, in the case of the AIIB, it's very common for the institution to co-finance projects in Asia with other organizations, whether they're regional development banks like the Asian Development Bank, or the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or international or global banks like the International Finance Corporation or the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So I think that the relationship among international financial institutions is really one of collaboration rather than competition. So the IBRD and the African Development Bank and the ADB, I think all of them, the reasons for their establishment can be explained in the manner which we've just discussed. Some of those same considerations also apply to the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which was established in 1991, but the spur for its creation was a rather specific event, which was the imminent collapse of the imminent end to the Cold War. So you're all too young to remember all of this. It reminds me when I was young, people would talk about the Cuban crisis, and it always seemed to me a very historical event. It didn't mean much to me, but it meant a lot for the people who lived through it. And I think for people like Professor Sato and myself, we lived through the Cold War, and it was kind of a sort of defining feature or defining force on our generation and the generation before us. So there was a very different view of how the world ought to be, held by those in the West broadly and those that were in the Soviet bloc, sort of generally. And the differences in ideology were really what fueled the Cold War. So the ideology of the West was that there ought to be liberal notions of openness that marked both economies and societies, and on the one hand, and within the Soviet sphere, there was a view that that the market in particular needed at best to be controlled and potentially for it to be displaced by a command form of economy. And of course, with that, those notions of openness also go different views about expression and democracy and freedom and so forth. So there were very differing views on how the world ought to be. And with the Cold War, it was very much the case that one of those ideologies was in the ascendant, namely the ideologies that were promoted by the West. And with that, one saw the establishment of a new international financial institution, the EBRD, and the EBRD was set up to promote open economies, but not to do that everywhere, but only to do that in those countries that were formerly part of the Soviet bloc, which were committed to liberal ideals of democracy and pluralism and market economics. So this is important, and not only because it helps explain why the EBRD was established, it's a rather unique explanation, but it also is important for understanding the role that politics plays in investment decisions. So the general rule in international financial institutions is that the institutions may not take into account in their lending decisions the political character of the the country that is borrowing or the country that is hosting the project being financed. So there is a prohibition on that, and it's enshrined in the charters of all of the major international financial institutions. The exception is the EBRD, where in fact the EBRD's board looks every year at whether recipient countries remain committed to these liberal ideals and whether they are implementing policies that are consistent with them. And if they are not, then there are mechanisms available for suspending access to the funds of the institution. So that's a rather unique situation, but it makes the EBRD a very interesting organization to study as well as to work for, which I did for many years. So the final point I would make about the regional development banks is that while they are more geographically constrained, so they can only finance projects on the territory of the region that they are supporting, they do have a flexibility that the IBRD does not have. So, for example, all of the international financial institutions, all of the regional development banks, they all have the possibility of financing projects in the private sector. So they can finance without a guarantee from a member, and this therefore facilitates private sector financing. So in addition to the regional development banks, there are also three other institutions that I want to mention. The first is the International Development Association, IDA. This was established in 1960, and it was set up in order to support the least developed countries for whom IBRD financing was increasingly unaffordable. So this entailed IDA, which is also part of the World Bank Group, making loans on concessional terms or highly concessional terms, or even providing grant financing. So it was possible for grant financing or concessional funding to be provided by other institutions, but they could not do this using their ordinary capital. They could collect funds from others, typically their members, and these will be set aside separately in the form of grant funds or in the form of what is known at the Asian Development Bank and EBRD and AIB as special funds. So these special funds are legally separate from the ordinary capital resources, and the terms of the use of the special funds can be different from those of the ordinary capital resources. And if there are special funds, this enables those funds to be used, say, for concessional financing or for grant financing. An example of this is at the AIIB. There is a special fund, and it can be used and has been used recently to subsidize the interest that is paid by the least developed countries in relation to loans that they have had to take out to help them combat the effects on the economy of the COVID pandemic. But IDA was different because the whole purpose of IDA was to provide concessional funding and grant funding. And this occurred in 1960. So the organization is also interesting to study because its financial structure is different from those of the other institutions, and it relies for its own funding on support from the IBRD. So the profits that are generated by the other arm, by the major arms of the World Bank, or the main arm of the World Bank, are in part provided to IDA to enable IDA to undertake its business. Now, another organization that I wanted to mention, the second last one, is the International Fund for Agricultural Development. So this was established in 1977, and it was created to support rural development in the poorest countries. So we looked at why the regional development banks were established. We looked at why the World Bank was established. We looked at why the EBRD was established. So each of these institutions, they have their story, and IFAD too has its story about why it was created. And it came about at a time of oil crisis in the world. So just like the fall of the Berlin Wall will be history for all of the students, the oil crises of the world will be ancient history for you, I'm sure. But this was a time that had a profound effect on the world's economy. And there were also a number of winners from the crisis that was brought about. And the winners were those oil-producing countries which overnight found themselves to be incredibly wealthy in terms of the revenues that they were generating. Of course, they were, and in some instances still are, very poor. They have major development needs, but they did have, many of them at that time had a lot of money, and there was an effort made to encourage those countries, particularly the countries in the Gulf, to channel those funds into development. And those countries, the Gulf countries in particular, were happy to do that, but they didn't want to have to rely on the existing structures where they had very little influence. So they could have channeled more money into, say, grant funds and special funds at other institutions, but that would not have given them an appreciably greater degree of influence. And so what came about was a conference that led to the establishment of the International Fund for Agricultural Development. And the organization has a very large number of members, and not quite as many members as the World Bank, but almost as many. And those members are really fall into three categories. This is how they're identified in the charter of the institution, but there are those which come from that group of oil-producing countries, not only from the Gulf, but from other countries as well that were petroleum producers, say Nigeria on the African continent or Indonesia on the Asian continent. And so that is one category. And there is another category which is development countries generally. And the third category are the category of countries that would be viewed as not receiving support from the institution, but which would provide financial support to the institution. So there were really three categories of shareholders there, and that's important for how the voting structures and so forth were all set out. So that's the International Fund for Agricultural Development. That's another institution where I worked. I was the general counsel there for a few years. And then finally, the institution where until 2 weeks ago, I was also the general counsel, but where I remain general counsel emeritus, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank was established in 2015. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the AIB in a moment, but if you do have more questions, then again, please to list them in the chat. So the slides you have about the AIB are quite extensive, so I won't summarize them all, but you can see quite a lot there about what the driving forces were behind its establishment. And I think that the formal moments are all documented and they're uncontroversial. So there were speeches in particular made by the then and current president of China about the desirability of establishing an institution that would focus on financing infrastructure in Asia. So this really is what galvanized the efforts to create such an institution. And China has been the driving force behind this institution. If you look at when the first conference was called together from interested parties, then you can see that the ambitions of the institution subsequently grew. So it seems that at the outset, it was expected that members would be drawn mainly from Asia, but by the time that the charter was adopted, then many countries from all of the populated continents were involved. So this includes Canada in North America, includes many countries in Latin America. It includes many countries in Africa and many in the Pacific. So by the time the charter was adopted, there were countries from across the world, and today there are, I think, 103 approved members, and there's about 20 of those that are still going through the process of ratification. So these are countries whose membership applications have been accepted by the AIB, but which then still need to get their parliamentary approvals and so forth. But there are about 103 members. So all of the, so that's more than half of the countries in the world. And there are other countries that continue to express interest, and there are other countries whose applications are being processed. So I don't know where we will come out, but I would expect that over the next few years, we will add materially to the current number. Within Asia, which is the region that the bank has set up to support, almost all of the countries within Asia as defined by a cartographer are included. Turkmenistan is not a member. Bhutan is not a member. Syria is not a member. Yemen is not a member. And Japan is not a member. So if you look at all those countries, I think there are reasons for each of these countries not being members, or maybe I should say more accurately, not being members at this time. Maybe they will become members. And in the case of Japan, it is the second largest economy in Asia. It's the third largest in the world. It's if it became a member of the AIB, it would need to have a commensurate number of shares. So the share structure of the AIB would have to be modified to accommodate that. I think the other countries, they could become members without any real effort on the part of the AIB. They could be accommodated quite easily. But all of these countries are very welcome to join. And personally, I would be very keen for Japan to become a member of the AIB when Japan feels that that is right for it. The notion of Asia is defined quite expansively at the AIIB, and it's reflected in the Charter. So it includes, for example, not only how a cartographer would define Asia, and that, broadly speaking, is how the UN Statistical Division would define Asia, but with some changes. So the whole of the Russian Federation is viewed as part of Asia at the AIIB. At the UN, the whole of the Russian Federation is viewed as part of Eastern Europe. But the AIIB, it's all viewed as part of Asia. And also at the AIIB, the whole of the Pacific is viewed as part of Asia. So I, as a citizen of New Zealand, I am part of Asia at the AIIB, and I'm viewed as being a staff member from a regional country. So that is Asia. And then outside of Asia, I think all of the economies of the G20 are members, with the exception of Japan, as we mentioned, and the United States, and also Mexico. There are a few other economies. Nigeria I think, will become a member fairly soon. South Africa is already been admitted to membership, but most of the large economies of the world are members. But I think the three big exceptions, I would say, are those that are members of the G20, but not members of the AIIB, namely the US, Japan, and Mexico. Now, I can't explain Mexico. I don't know the reason for Mexico, but in the case of Japan, you will have your own views on this. And in the case of the US, if there are Americans in the class, they may also have their views. At the time that the AIIB was established, the United States encouraged many of its allies not to join the AIIB. And the reasons given at the time were they were concerned that the AIIB, being owned and controlled by borrowing states and being sponsored by one of those states, may not be able to preserve the high standards of investment that were associated with the other institutions. And therefore they discouraged that. So that was the official line. So this was the Obama administration who pursued that. I think you hear people from that administration acknowledge that maybe that was a mistake, that they should have been in, but they weren't. They could still change. If they wanted to become a member, they could signal that. I think the difficulty for the United States is that even if the administration were to be supportive of membership, the Congress would have to support that. And I think it's very difficult in the Congress often to support an initiative like this because of the way that the domestic politics play out. So that's the situation with the US. I think too that there must be an element of some countries being especially supportive of some of the institutions which they dominate and which are a bit fearful of competition. So in the case of the US, they have a great deal of influence over the World Bank and the IFC, and those are organizations which can finance projects in all of the countries where the AIIB can finance projects. So maybe that's how the United States likes that. It likes the projects on that part of the world to be financed by organizations where it has a substantial amount of influence. And its level of influence at the AIIB would be less. It could be significant, but it would be less than what it is elsewhere. In the case of Japan, Japan has a great deal of influence over the Asian Development Bank, and the Asian Development Bank finances projects on a subset of the territory where which the AIIB is set up to support. So the ADB does not finance projects in Russia, for example. So it may be that that there's an element of competition that is perceived, but this is just some speculation on the part of a number of commentators. I don't have a view on this myself, but I would be very interested to hear what others have to say about this. And that sort of, brings me to an end, brings to an end the discussion of the international organizations, or the major international financial institutions, which followed the establishment of the IBRD. So we've looked now at the establishment of IFAD in 1956. We've looked at the Inter-American Development Bank in 59, the African Development Bank in 64, the Asian Development Bank in 66, the EBRD in 1991. We've also looked at the establishment of IDA in 1960, the establishment of the IFAD in 1977, and the establishment of the AIIB in 2015. So that, I think, concludes the introduction to all of these organizations and gives you a sense of how the international financial institution landscape has evolved over this period. Let me pause there and ask if there are questions that anyone has. And let me just also look into the chat function and see if there's anything new, but I don't see anything just yet. So I see that Professor Sato has a tricky question for me.
Thank you very much, Gerald. So now, just a few words for the end. Thank you very much for excellent presentation. I just add some information as a Japanese, former colleague to you. In fact, and the World Bank is also very important for Japan. In fact, and Japan also borrowed loan from World Bank for the reconstruction after the war, of course, including Shinkansen. The Shinkansen was one of the major infrastructure which was funded by World Bank, and we just completed all the payment just 20 years ago or something like that. Such a huge funding and made Japan its current economic great number 3 in the GDP level. This is thanks to the World Bank and international financial organizations. And of course, because of that, Japan is now one of the biggest donor or shareholder of the World Bank. And in fact, I worked with Gerald 1995, which is secondment by my law firm, which is funded by Japanese government, the Ministry of Finance, because Japan is actually assisting EBRD for this special agreement with Europe to donate. It's a grant funding for initiation of the EBRD's legal transition team. Gerald is the head of that, and we are just working together to law reform to the country of operations in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, which is actually collapsed. And socialism didn't have any meaningful law to support financial activities, because no need for that, because all the command economy. So in this sense, in order to the EBRDs actually work in the field, reality, law is quite required. The financial law, the bankruptcy law, company law, and any basic law is missing. So our mission is just to introduce this market oriented laws very soon. So that is also the Japanese contribution. And I think now EBRD has operational funding for this kind of assisting to this facilitation of the lending. And also another point is Japan is also a controversy dispute with especially the European countries such as Netherlands regarding especially the Uzbekistan, which is actually all this refusing any sort of multiple party systems of democracy, which is actually a prerequisite condition for the EBRD's funding. So the always argument in the board is, this Netherlands is just to try to terminate any operation in this country because of this charter. But Japan is defended these countries. The logic is unless we pay to support their economy, the democratization cannot be possible. So this is a kind of egg and chickens in this sense. So Japan's approach is a carrot and whips, something like that. But the European is more or less kind of ideologically just punishing sanction things. So that is also some support point of the argument. So that is a very interesting experience myself. And so I'm very happy to Gerald is working for AIIB. It's a bit controversial regarding because it's a political stance and governance issues. So I'm very much expected this lecture will also inspire you to consider how Japan could work together with this AIIB in a meaningful way. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Professor Sato. I think those observations are very interesting. On the first, I think that legal reform and having the right laws in place is essential to development. So you need to have economic progress to foster development, and in order to support that, you really have to have the private sector as the engine, and you need to make sure that the right legal structures, not only the rules, but also the enforcement agencies are all in place and working so that you can achieve the kind of development you have in mind. So I agree that legal reform is very important, and some institutions, of course, are much more involved in that than others. The EBRD was very involved in and remains very involved in legal reform. And the second point, yes, I think it's an interesting issue. If you want to encourage countries to engage in political reform, then what do you do? If you disagree with what they are doing, if you're the EBRD, you're required to have a view on it. If you are, say, the AIIB, you do not have a view, you're prohibited from taking into account in your investment decisions anything other than economic considerations. But if you do, if you are able to have a view, or if you're required to have a view, then in extreme cases, a dilemma is always presented. Ought one to show one's displeasure by disengaging, or is it better to register one's displeasure but to continue engaging and hope to influence from within? So I think that's a situation that can have to be faced in difficult instances. So with that, let me conclude today's lecture. Let me thank you all. I look forward to the seminar tomorrow. I know that there are 2 students who have been allocated to each to help lead the discussion and help record the summaries and to pose questions on the chat or to even speak, which will be great. So I look forward to seeing you all again tomorrow. Thank you very much, and goodbye, everyone.